Our next guest here for the afternoon session. I'm going to bring up Eric Liu. Eric Liu is the founder and CEO of Citizen University, a national nonprofit that promotes the art of powerful citizenship. He is also executive director of the Aspen Institute's Citizenship and American Identity program. Liu served as a White House speechwriter for President Bill Clinton and later as the president's deputy domestic policy advisor. He currently serves on numerous civic and nonprofit boards. Liu is the author of several books, including You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen, which each of you received today. Please join me in giving Eric Liu a warm Colorado welcome.
Thank you so much, Jerome, and thank you all for having me here today. This has just been really exciting. My wife and I got here last night and got in town early enough to see the fireside chat with Chief Mullen from Charleston, and that was a very moving and powerful conversation, one that I know has been kind of woven in with a lot of the themes that you've been wrestling with and chewing on and talking about, and I just want to say, I'll tell you a little bit about my work, but I go to a lot of events, I go to a lot of settings like this, and there's something really special about a gathering like this, led the way that the Colorado Health Foundation is led, with a sense of purpose and a sense of social and civic mission, but also the ways in which, just again, at that fireside chat last night and kind of listening around during lunchtime today, sensing how much of a community there is here and how much you all are learning from each other and pushing each other and engaging each other in ways that are really creative and useful. So it's really gratifying to me to get to spend some time. And I'm really grateful to the foundation as well, not just for bringing me here today, but for making it possible for you all to get a copy of my new book on citizen power. So what I'd like to do today actually is talk a bit about our moment, talk about our power, and then really in the third place talk about making a different kind of case for inclusion. And those are the three chunks of what I'd like to speak about today. But before I do that, let me just give you a little bit of context about myself and the work that I do. So as Jerome mentioned, I run a nonprofit called Citizen University. We're based in Seattle, but we do work all around the United States. And our work is really about trying to democratize understanding of how power works in civic life. Both at the level of skills and strategy and tactics, but also at the sense of the level of values. What's the moral frame within which people are called to cultivate their capacity to exercise power in civic life? And so I often in talking about citizenship, have a very simple quasi-scientific formula that I talk about, which goes like this: power plus character equals citizenship. And what I mean by that is that citizenship, by which I mean, by the way, I'm not talking about documentation status under the immigration and naturalization laws of the United States. I'm talking about a more capacious ethical sense of being a member of the body, a part of the community, right? A contributor, a pro-social contributor to community. That's my notion of citizenship for these purposes. And when I talk about power plus character, what I mean is, in the first place, being literate in and fluent in the ways of power, how you actually get stuff done. But then in the second place, talking about character, having a cultivated moral sense, a set of values to which that literacy in power is actually harnessed. And I think we can see all around us in these times right now the dangers of having only one side or the other of that equation, right? Power and a fluency in power without character is mere sociopathy. But character, having a cultivated ethical sense without having any accompanying clue of how to get stuff done in the world, how to move systems, how to make institutions change, that's just self-indulgent philosophizing. And so it's the combination of these, power plus character, that makes for citizenship. And that is the way we think about our work at Citizen University and the way we think about our times. And I think, in a nominally self-governing democratic republic like ours, This work of teaching power and teaching citizenship matters all the time, right? But I think we would all agree that it matters particularly right now, that we are living through an exceptional moment in the life of this republic. And this is the first thing that I want to spend some time talking about, which is our moment. Our moment is one that is defined a lot of ways, because of what's going on in Washington, D.C., and because of the kind of intense, unprecedented nature of the disruptions of national politics. It's tempting to think that our moment began on November 9th, 2016. But it would be very wrong to think that. The moment that we are in is a moment of, well, as your conference theme really focuses on, a moment of profound inequity, a moment of nearly unprecedented concentration of wealth, opportunity, voice, and clout, nearly unprecedented inequality at levels not seen in this country since just before the Great Depression. Right? This is the moment that we're in. This is not a moment that began on Election Day 2016. This is a moment that's been in the making for 3 or 4 decades now in the United States of grinding tectonic shifts in our notions of equity and our notions of what it means to be one country. And during these 4 decades in which wealth, power, voice has concentrated into what's popularly understood these days as the 1%, although as we can get into a little bit later, the 1% is sort of a very rough, imprecise proxy for how privilege actually is concentrated in the United States today. But that language of the 1% is indicative of what we're going through right now. And I would say to you that what happened on Election Day here in this country was not a cause, it was a symptom. It was a symptom of this deep divide. It was a symptom of the way in which this country has been pulling apart and becoming more unequal. At the very same time that this country has been shifting demographically. And so when you can foresee in a matter of decades the day when this is no longer a majority white nation, and you couple that with this sense that, well, not just sense, this reality that median wages in the United States have been roughly stagnant or declining for the last generation, that even since the end of the Great Recession, 95% of the gains of the so-called recovery have accrued to the 1%. That when you couple that kind of rigging of the game economically with this kind of tectonic demographic shift, it's actually a miracle we didn't get this election result sooner. It's a miracle we didn't get this kind of disruption and this knocking over of the status quo sooner. And so this is the moment we're in. And it's a moment defined not just by the election of Donald Trump. It was a moment defined by the emergence of Bernie Sanders, who in his own way challenged every notion of status quo and establishment, and who named the rigging of the game explicitly. But it's a moment defined, if you rewind before that, defined as well by the Tea Party, by Occupy Wall Street, by the emergence of Black Lives Matter, by the emergence of the Dreamers. We live in an age where simultaneously you have this incredible concentration, monopolization of wealth, voice, clout, and presence in this country. But now what we're beginning to see at last is a great push back. And I would say to you that in the United States and indeed around the world right now, we are living through a time of incredible surges of bottom-up people power. Every one of those movements that I described earlier, from the Tea Party to Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, $15 now. You name all these movements right now, and you might say, well, they haven't quote-unquote succeeded. They haven't won, right? Maybe the Trump train won, but the Sanders movement didn't. To which I say, not true. In the first place, all of these movements are part of an ecosystem of change, and each one is making the next one possible. But then secondly, I would say to you the fact that it is common parlance today to speak of the 1%. It is common parlance to talk about police killings and the injustice of our criminal justice system. It is common parlance now in the United States for us to reckon with the grinding nature of poverty wages that so many millions of Americans have to try to live through. The fact is that the conversation has shifted in the United States, and that is in good part because of this incredible phalanx of bottom-up citizen movements. And these movements, though they may come from the left or come from the right or come from points and directions that are completely orthogonal to a left-right axis, are part of this moment. And if we want to understand this moment, it's simply not a moment of business as usual. We can see that in the reality TV show of Washington, D.C. today. But it's also true just in the bread and butter day-to-day life of what you do worrying about health care, access to health, health outcomes, health disparities, disproportionality in health care and health outcomes here in the state of Colorado. Just in your bread and butter day-to-day life, you know and feel that we are in a time of great tectonic disruption. And we're in a time where people have been taking it for 3 or 4 decades, but are no longer taking it anymore, right? And to me, this is an exciting moment. Not because everybody who is now mad as hell, not going to take it anymore, knows exactly what they're going to do, or is exactly strategically smart about how to do it, or has exactly figured out the right pathway to success, but because there is an awakening right now, right? And I would say even for those who, and again, cards on the table, I have worked for a Democrat. My views in politics are generally progressive, but what I'm describing here is a completely cross-partisan phenomenon. And one thing that I would tip my hat to Donald Trump about is that this man who occupies the White House right now, he alone is single-handedly, I would say, responsible for one of the greatest surges of civic engagement in the United States that we've seen in over half a century. He may not have intended it, but there's no question that his presence has catalyzed and awakened tens of millions of Americans who had been complete bystanders, checked out, perhaps maybe somewhat interested spectators, but had not been on the field and are now stepping on the field, right? And that's, again, not just people who are in the quote-unquote resistance, resisting the Trump agenda. It's people who are reform conservatives saying, well, hold on a second. What's going on here? People like Jeff Flake of Arizona, Republican senator, saying, hold on a second. If we believe in conservative principles, is what's going on here hewing to our principles? People on the right who are libertarians saying, hold on now. You may like some of the policy outcomes coming out of this administration, but is the way that it's happening in a way that is, again, concentrating power in the Capitol something that we want to actually sign on to? There's a cross-partisan, cross-ideological awakening going on in this country. People saying, hold on a second. I don't like how this game is being played. And I think this is to me, though it is scary and disruptive, and though no one today, I think, can plausibly predict what the state of our republic will be in 6 or 12 or 18 months, I would still say net, this is an incredibly positive thing because we are not in stasis. We are not paralyzed with cynicism. We are not stuck. We are waking up. And that is our moment. And so how does that bear on the work that you do? Well, it bears 100 different ways, right? When you have people starting to realize that their individual suffering, whether it's the fact that they live in a food desert and can't get the kinds of foods that might get their family off a pathway to obesity and diabetes. When you think about whether it might be people who are no longer accepting the fact that their part of town simply is going to have lead pipes and bad water quality. When you think about folks who realize that, hey, it's just not okay anymore to think about gun violence in this part of a community as just a fact of life, a part of nature, but that these things can change. This kind of political civic awakening that's going on in our country right now, this reacquaintance that citizens are having with the power that we've always had and have always heedlessly, mindlessly been throwing away and giving away, this awakening now will come to bear now on questions of health, health equity, and health policy. And so this is an incredible opportunity for us to begin changing the way that we actually engage communities, not as clients, not as recipients, not as beneficiaries of our largesse, not as people who need guidance and help, but as participants, as citizens, as creators of a new kind of contract and a new kind of deal in this country. Well, that brings me to the second thing that I wanted to speak about today, which is actually what I mean by power. Our power. I've been talking about citizen power. I already defined a moment ago what I mean by citizen, which is I'm not talking about documentation status. I'm talking about this bigger sense of being a member of the body. But when I say power, I mean something very specific. I mean a capacity to ensure that others do as you would like them to do. Now, for some folks, that definition gives them the creeps. It's a little bit menacing. It's a little bit like, I'm going to dominate you I'm going to be the boss of you, and I'm going to make you do what I want you to do, right? But I really invite you, if you have any kind of misgivings or qualms about that, to set those to the side for the moment and take an honest look at life. Because in every arena of life, in every circle of relationship, not just professional, not just in the community and civic realms, but in our own personal lives, families, neighbors, friends, we as humans are always trying to get other humans to do as we would like them to do, right? The only question is whether in public life, in the civic arena, we are going to feel sheepish about naming it. Naming it and being candid about the reality of power, and therefore the reality of inequities of power, is the first and necessary step to actually addressing these inequities. If you can't even name it, if you can't even talk about power, good luck dealing with inequity. You're just going to be dancing around the edges, doing polite talk about how you want to be nicer to some people, but you're not going to get to underlying causes, and you're not going to get to the ways in which structurally the game has been rigged, and that structurally the conduits of power, institutions, networks, organizations, narratives, through which all forms of power, people power, money power, ideas power, the power of crowds and force, the conduits through which these forms of power are flowing are not conduits that God gave us one day and said, here's your power structure. These are man-made, and they are man-remade at all times, right? Man and woman remade at all times. And so becoming conscious about power and understanding that our first responsibility, not only as citizens, but for all of you who are catalytic citizens, right? Every one of you is a node in a network. Every one of you is a creator of a web of great consequence, dealing with lots of different kinds of communities and lots of different settings, trying to reckon with these questions of poor health. You have more power than you realize, right? And so the title of my book is I'm not some dude coming in from Seattle selling you some new age slogan that you're more powerful than you think. I'm stating a fact of civic life, that most people in this country have far more capacity to make change than they ever activate, and that activating it begins with naming it. Well, once you name it, there are, by my reckoning, 3 broad laws of power in civic life that are worth understanding for all of you as on-the-ground practitioners, as researchers, as policymakers, as caregivers, whatever it might be. And the laws are these. Number 1, first law of power. Power compounds. It concentrates, just as powerlessness does, right? And this is as obvious as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. That you can put it colloquially, that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That those who have clout tend to get more clout. Those who get some exposure in the media as a spokesperson on issue X tend to get more exposure, right? This is the nature of systems, that advantages and disadvantages compound. That's a reality of power in all systems, even in one that is, again, nominally democratic and open like ours. Law number 2, power justifies itself. So at every turn, institutions and individuals who are incumbent holders of power love to spin elaborate stories about why it ought to be that way, about why it is the nature of the world that they should have power and implicitly you should not, right? In earlier centuries, this was what you might think of as divine right. Kings would tell you, of course I'm king. God said I'm king because I'm the son of God. Get on board, right? Today we don't, in the United States at least, believe in divine right as a basis of power legitimacy, but there are all kinds of variations on divine right in our politics. If you think about the language in the politics, for instance, of trickle-down economics, trickle-down economics is a secular version of a claim to divine right. It says that really rich people, today's really rich people, are quote-unquote job creators, which is the equivalent of royals. They are job creators, and so we must pay them ritual tribute. We must treat them nicely, these job creators. And if we treat them nicely, then perhaps they will treat us nicely, and some of their prosperity and goodwill will leak down to the rest of us, right? That is the narrative of trickle-down economics, and is a narrative that does many things. It justifies why those who have wealth have wealth. It justifies why you better not think about raising taxes on the wealthy. You better not think about regulating the business activities of those who are current wealth holders. But it does another thing. It subtly issues a threat. It's an intimidation tactic. It says, if you should even think about messing with me, raising my taxes, making my life as an economic royalist a little bit less comfortable, then watch out because your jobs might disappear. My prosperity won't leak down to you anymore, and you're going to be hurting. To put it in kind of gangsterish terms, it'd be a shame. It'd be a shame if my prosperity could no longer leak down to you. It'd be a shame, right? This kind of subtle intimidation tactic. Well, this is one example of this kind of narrative of self-justification. But there are others. We live in an age right now as well where in the headlines, in all our institutions, the debates about white privilege are a pretty good example of challenging a dominant narrative of why white is right, why it ought to be that the leaders of institutions should be white, why it is as a default expectation that of course our institutions should bend toward the preferences, the fears, the wants, the felt pressures of folks in the white community. The announcement yesterday from this administration's Justice Department that they're going to start paying special attention to the grievances of whites who feel put upon and discriminated against is one slice of this kind of narrative. Male privilege is yet another. We may think today, oh, come on, we're long past an age where people said that, used to say in American politics that politics was for men and women should stay home and civic life is for men and women shouldn't dirty themselves or pollute themselves by getting involved with untoward types dealing with very messy issues, right? That was the language that was used 100 years ago in this country. And 100 years ago in this country, women decided to push on through that narrative and say, we beg to differ. We think we will actually organize. We think we will organize to, for instance, get the right to vote. We think we will organize to change the laws in this country around alcohol. We think we will organize in this country to show our force in all different kinds of issues, local and national. So this second law, that power is always justifying itself, is one that we often don't perceive. It's like water to fish because it's just the dominant narrative, the dominant set of explanations for how things are that we've kind of internalized, right? Now, if all you had were these first two laws, that number one, in the first place, power is always concentrating and compounding, and number two, that power is always justifying itself, you'd be stuck in a pretty grim doom loop, right? You'd be stuck in this place where like, wow, a small number of people are going to hoard and monopolize all the resource and power in this community and then tell you why you should be happy about it as they grind you down to dust, right? And indeed, all around the world, there are such doom loops in motion right now. Those of you who follow international news have followed what's gone on in Venezuela in recent days, where that country's people voted to commit democratic suicide, voted to end power of the people and to transfer power into a quasi-dictatorial body controlled by the president there. Right? But it's not just foreign countries that end up in these grim doom loops of monopolization and domination and tyranny. There are communities in every state in the Union, and there are parts in every county of the state of Colorado where you can see that same doom loop setting in, where people, as Chief Mullen was saying last night, are simply without hope, simply swim in currents of cynicism, and do not believe that they can or should try to change their situation. And the economic and the psychic and the health ripple effects of that are what you deal with in your work professionally. So if all we had were these first two laws, we'd be stuck. But what fortunately breaks us out of that doom loop of laws number 1 and 2 is law number 3, which is this: power is infinite. Power is infinite. And here again, I'm not trying to sell you some woo-woo New Age line. I'm describing to you a simple fact of social and civic life, which that it is wholly possible to generate brand new power out of thin air through the magic act of organizing, inviting one other human to engage with you on one common endeavor that requires us common goals, thinking about common strategies, thinking about common pathways around common obstacles, that this generates power where it did not previously exist. And the idea that power is infinite is important because it cuts against so many of our intuitions. We have an intuition, I think, as humans, perhaps because the laws of physics tell us that, conservation of energy, that in this room, if someone's going to get more heat or energy, someone else in this room is going to have to get less, because it's a zero-sum deal in physics, right? And a lot of our intuitions about things may be derived from that. But here's the thing. I'm not talking about physics. I'm talking civics. And in civics, it is possible to add to the net amount of power in a previously closed system. It is possible to create positive sum, non-zero sum outcomes by generating power where it did not previously exist, right? And that is true on every issue. So that litany of movements I described at the beginning, Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party, $15 now, Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers, LGBTQ movements right now, all of these are living, tangible, vivid examples of the infinitude of power in civic life. None of these movements asked for permission. None of these movements got a permit to organize themselves. None of these movements said that they were going to take away by coming into existence. What they did is they brought people who'd been out of the fold, out of the loop, off the field, into the fold, into the loop, and onto the field. And this idea that power is infinite is really important, because I think one of the great consequences of living in the moment that we're in right now, this moment simultaneously of grinding, crunching inequality and the hopelessness and cynicism that comes with that, while at the same time people are getting awakened and wanting to push back against that, one of the consequences is that too many people remain stuck in a zero-sum frame of mind. Too many people have gotten too comfortable justifying the system as it is, right? Well, each of these three laws actually yields, in turn, an imperative for action for us as citizens, and for you as catalytic citizens using the medium and the methods and the metaphors of health to heal the body politic, right? So if, in the first place, power is always concentrating and compounding into these winner-take-all monopolized games, then our first imperative is simply this: change the game. If in the second place, power is always justifying itself and creating these elaborate narratives of why it is that those who have and those who have not, then our imperative in the second place is to change the story. And then third of all, if it is the case that power is infinite, and yet so many of our fellow Americans remain stuck in a mindset, an equation that is zero-sum, stuck in the sense that I can't get without taking something away from somebody, and therefore I'm not going to try because someone's going to grind me back down, then our imperative is to change the equation. And these three imperatives of changing the game, the story, and the equation of civic power are, I think, a useful way to think about our responsibilities and opportunities right now in this incredible moment. I'll give you one very hands-on example of how these imperatives play out, just in my own life as a citizen, and an example that actually bears out on this question of inequity and how we deal with inequity. So I'm from Seattle, as I mentioned, and some of you may know that Seattle was the first major city in the United States fairly recently to enact and adopt a $15 minimum wage, right? And some of you may have followed the way in which that enactment of a $15 minimum wage in Seattle has set in motion a bit of a contagion in this networked way, where other cities and indeed some other states are either going to 15 or approaching 15 or just raising the wage generally, right? But what many folks don't know is that even before Seattle did what it did, and I was on the board, the mayor's commission that actually struck the deal that got us to 15, that even before Seattle got to 15, what actually set these dominoes falling, what actually got things going, was something that happened in a neighboring little town called SeaTac. SeaTac is the airport town, the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, right? And SeaTac is a town where most of the residents are low-wage workers, many of them immigrants, many of them people of color, working in the airline and hospitality industries, either working at the port, the airport, working in the hotels and rental car companies and what have you, serving that general industry around there. And what happened in this tiny little town of SeaTac is that a group of citizens began to organize and say, you know what? We are the backbone of this economy for this airport and this whole part of this state's economy. And if we actually come together and organize, we can change the game, the story, and the equation of power in our community. And so they did that. On the minimum wage in general in the United States, but particularly in an airport town that's dominated by big airlines and big hotel chains, and you have this kind of disempowered immigrant workforce, you have a game in which the game was classic trickle-down economics, in which the folks in power were saying, hey, don't raise wages here, because if you raise wages, we're going to have to fire people, right? And so that was enough of a threat to make people say, okay, we won't make trouble, we'll just take it, we'll just take these crummy wages where we got to work 2 or 3 jobs to actually make ends meet, because we sure wouldn't want to lose these 2 or 3 jobs that we have to make ends meet, right? That was the game at the beginning. But what these organized activists did was they began to change the game by saying, you know what? We don't have to go through the traditional legislative arenas like the city council in SeaTac or the state legislature, which are dominated by forces that sell this story of self-justification, this trickle-down story. We can bypass them. And if we get enough signatures, we can actually put a measure on the ballot. And they did that. Folks who had never done a single civic thing in their lives, had never given a public speech, had never done door knocking, had never organized other folks, started doing all these things. And they started showing up. And as they did that, they began to change the game, because they realized not only that they could bypass legislative bodies and put a measure on the ballot to raise the wage to 15, but that in so doing they were changing the story too, right? And the story was not just that these were helpless, voiceless, low-income workers, most of them women of color, but rather that these were people who were coming into their own as participants in the civic and economic life of this community and this country. And as they did so, they began to take that trickle-down economic story and flip it on its head. And they started offering a counter-narrative that said, the true source of prosperity in SeaTac, the true source of prosperity in any community is not the quote-unquote job creators at big corporations. It's us, the little people who do the buying and the working and the living, as they said in It's a Wonderful Life, right? Who do the buying, the working, and the living that actually sets in motion a positive feedback loop of increasing demand. It's us who, when we have more money in our pockets, we buy stuff. And when we buy stuff, businesses have more customers, and they end up hiring more workers. We called it middle-out economics. That prosperity, in reality, emerges from the middle out and the bottom up, not from the top down. And they changed this story. And that allowed them to change the equation of power in this community. That it was no longer just folks who were labor organizers working at big unions, fighting against chambers of commerce and having the same old tired battle they've been having for decades on wages and inequality and inequity, but that you now had lots of new folks rushing onto the field who'd never participated in civic life before, fundamentally changing the equation. Well, that ballot measure passed in SeaTac by a few hundred votes, and it passed just at the time that the city of Seattle next door was having a mayoral race and city council races. And it began to change the dynamic of that mayoral race. All of a sudden, the mayoral candidates had to hop on that train and say, we're for 15 also. Well, I'm for 15 today. Well, I'm for 15 tomorrow, right? And all these folks getting on board at 15. And this all started with a few humble airport and hospitality workers in SeaTac organizing, right? This is one simple example of how you change the game, the story, and equation to begin to shift the balance of power and address in real, tangible ways inequity. Well, this brings me to the final note that I want to say, though, about our moment and our time and understanding our power, and that is the kind of case that we make for inclusion, right? One thing that happened in SeaTac, and this is true of every kind of case that I would make for inclusion, the case that I would make for why public-facing health organizations should have staffs that reflect the diversity of the communities they're serving. Why colleges and universities should take affirmative action to ensure that their student bodies reflect the full breadth of diversity of the populace of this country. Why police forces ought to be taking affirmative efforts to ensure that not only they have trust and relationships of the kind that Chief Mullen was describing yesterday with the communities they serve, but that their actual police forces are more reflective and representative of the communities that they serve. Now, why? Traditionally, if we're honest, in realms like health and education and economic justice, the prevailing reason why people make this case for inclusion basically boils down to this: it's nice. It's nice. It would be nice. It would be fair. It would be fair and nice to include these people, right? It's not nice to not include these people. It's not fair, right? And I grant that an argument from niceness, an argument from fairness will take you a certain distance with a certain group of folks. But if we want to actually fundamentally change the way that we think about what it means to heal the body politic, to have healthy communities where people are full-on participants in economic, civic, social activities, then the case that we make can't just be about it's nice. It would be more nice to do this. The case that we make has to be about self-interest properly understood. The case that we make has to be this, that when you raise the wage in CTAC, you're not creating some zero-sum game where businesses are now suffering and they have to shut their doors. When you raise the wage in Seattle, by the way, Seattle has just gone in its, I don't know, X number of consecutive month of being the biggest boom town in the United States, right? Our unemployment rate has fallen to its lowest level in decades. The restaurant business, which screamed bloody murder when we raised the wage for $15, is literally cannot grow, cannot keep up with its own growth. Right? Seattle is booming. Why? Because of middle economics. Because we set in motion this positive feedback loop of increasing demand. Because we showed concretely that we're all better off when we're all better off. And that showing this is more than just saying this. Showing this through something like an experiment in raising the wage. Showing this and ensuring that people with the worst health outcomes get better access to health care. Showing this in a way that is about addressing all the disparities and inequities that you reckon with, whether it's around obesity in our sugar economy, or it's around the opioid epidemic, around gun violence or teen pregnancies. All these different public health issues all boil down to the same thing. The reason to care about these things, the reason to be inclusive, the reason to embrace and activate the full breadth of our diversity in the society is not only, in fact, not even primarily because it's nice, but it's because it's the only way we will thrive and succeed and survive as a society. This is mutual self-interest, and this is remembering that all self-interest, at the end of the day, is mutual self-interest. And there's no better teacher for that than someone who works in the realm of health, right? Now, some of you I know are trained as epidemiologists. Some of you work in public health professionally. But the charge that I want to give you here in closing is this. We have to get it so that every member of our community starts seeing themselves as an epidemiologist, right? Now, that may seem like a fancy thing to do and kind of unrealistic, but what I mean is this. We got to be ensuring and enabling and empowering every member of every one of our communities to be able to see in systems, to understand the interconnectedness of all our opportunities and all of our challenges, to be able to take responsibility and to see what a false choice it is to say, is it individual responsibility or structural collective responsibility? That these things feed one another in that same kind of feedback loop, right? And that we have an opportunity and responsibility to model this. And you may say, well, gosh, this seems awfully sophisticated and complex for your everyday American, and I completely reject that notion. I've taken this notion of thinking like an epidemiologist, thinking like seeing in systems, to classes of 4th and 5th graders. And I've asked these 4th and 5th graders, what's an example of a system in your life? Hands go up. Like how water gets to the water fountain in our hallway? Yeah, That's a pretty good example of a system. What's another one? Hand goes up. Like how my favorite cereal gets to Safeway. Yeah, that's another good example of a system. Humans are intuitively primed to search for cause and effect. And young people, poor people, people of color, people on the margins of our opportunity structure in this society, some folks may think that this is beyond them. This is too much to ask of them. I say if we invite them, if we invite each other into this skill building of seeing in systems, taking responsibility for your piece of that system, understanding how social norms and attitudes and behaviors are contagious across these networks, then we will change something fundamentally. And this is what it means for us. If every citizen is an epidemiologist, then everybody in this room is a chief public health officer. Again, I don't care what your title is, and I don't care what your day job actually is. You are a chief public health officer in every circle you move in. And health in this day and age right now means teaching power. It means grabbing onto this moment that we're in, where folks are beginning to awaken. It means using this moment to open up for people an invitation to inhabit their own power, to occupy the full breadth of their own capacity to make change in community and civic life, and to change the game, the story, and the equation of how we build a healthier community and country together. I think that if we do this today, I guess I want to close with how I came to town and began yesterday, which was listening to the words of Chief Mullen from Charleston. I don't think Chief Mullen is a wizard or a person who came in from another planet who's got magical powers. I think he's somebody who followed that simple formula that I set out at the beginning of my remarks today. Power plus character equals citizenship. For those of you who heard his remarks, and for those of you who didn't, what he talked about was simply this, that he recognized that when the awful hate crimes and killings had happened in Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, he realized the moment that he got the call that because of the responsibility and the station and the authority he had in that community as both chief of police and as a node of epidemiological capacity in that community, that this was going to be his moment of truth. This was going to be his defining moment, right? He recognized his power in that time, but he coupled that recognition of the full breadth of his powers with a deep and abiding sense of character. And that character came out not just in the compassion that he showed to the victims' families and to all those who were traumatized. The compassion, that character, came out in the way that he handled himself. It came out in the way, frankly, that those pressure-filled days after that killing, those killings and that shooting, were not the beginning, but were in a sense the culmination of what had been many years of work, of trust building, and the earning of legitimacy in that community, right? And that required being real. That required naming power and naming inequity. That required inviting folks, as he did, to participate in the reordering of the equation of power. And it required doing so with integrity and with the sense that I'm doing this act of inclusion not to be nice, not out of pity or charity, but because I want our whole city to be healthier and stronger. I want Charleston to thrive. That is character. And so every one of us now, as chief public health officers of the places where you live and work, I urge you, I beg of you, to go practice power with character. And if we do that together, I don't care what goes on in Washington, D.C. I don't care what circus happens around us in our politics, in our civic life. I believe the health of the republic will be strong for a good long time to come. Thank you very much.